Imagine waking up one morning in the most successful black neighborhood in the entire United States. You step outside. The streets are clean. Your neighbor runs a law office 2 doors down. Across the street, a black-owned hotel, a movie theater, a hospital, a newspaper, a library, dentists, lawyers, doctors, grocers, all of them black-owned, all of them thriving. Now imagine that within the next 16 hours, every single one of those buildings is gone. Not abandoned, not foreclosed, not sold, burned, bombed, looted, erased. And then, for the next 75 years, nobody talks about it. This is the story of Greenwood, Black Wall Street, one of the most prosperous African American communities in American history. And this is the story of how it was systematically destroyed in a single night of racist terror that the American government tried to bury for generations. Stay with me, because what happened here matters more today than almost anything you will ever watch on this channel. To understand what happened in Tulsa in 1921, you have to understand the world that made it possible. Because the massacre didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the inevitable explosion of pressure that had been building in America for decades. The year is 1919. World War I has just ended. Hundreds of thousands of black American soldiers have returned home, men who fought for democracy in the muddy trenches of France, men who were told they were heroes, men who believed that maybe, just maybe, their sacrifice would finally earn them equal citizenship in their own country. They were wrong. What they came home to was something historians would later call the Red Summer, a wave of racial violence so widespread, so coordinated, so brutal that it stretched across more than 3 dozen American cities. White mobs attacked black neighborhoods in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in Elaine, Arkansas, in Knoxville, in Omaha. Hundreds of black Americans were killed. Thousands were displaced. And the perpetrators? Almost none of them faced justice. But the violence wasn't just physical. It was legal. It was systemic. It was woven into the fabric of American life. Jim Crow laws, named mockingly after a black minstrel character, had been reshaping Southern and Midwestern society since the 1870s. These laws mandated racial segregation in virtually every aspect of public life. Schools, hospitals, trains, restaurants, theaters, swimming pools, courtrooms, even cemeteries. The Supreme Court had blessed this system in 1896 with its Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, declaring that separate but equal was constitutionally acceptable, a ruling that would define American apartheid for the next 6 decades. And then there was the Ku Klux Klan. The original Klan had been largely suppressed after the Civil War. But in 1915, the same year the deeply racist film Birth of a Nation was released and screened at the White House, the Klan was reborn. And by 1921, it was growing at a terrifying pace, recruiting hundreds of thousands of members across the country, including in Oklahoma. The economics made the hatred worse. World War I had created an industrial boom, but that boom was uneven. Black workers who had migrated north to fill factory jobs during the war were now competing with returning white veterans for work. Resentment curdled into rage. And rage, in an atmosphere of impunity, curdled into violence. This is the world that existed in 1921. Segregated. Terrified. Seething with racial resentment on one side and determined, hard-won dignity on the other. And right in the middle of all of it, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was Greenwood. In the early 20th century, Tulsa, Oklahoma was a city divided, quite literally, by the Frisco Railroad tracks. On one side of those tracks, white Tulsa, with its oil money, its mansions, its all-white schools and institutions. On the other side, the Greenwood district, named after Greenwood Avenue, the neighborhood's main commercial artery, a 35-block stretch of black-owned enterprise and community life that was, by any measure, extraordinary. They called it Black Wall Street. And the name was not an exaggeration. Walk down Greenwood Avenue in 1921 and here is what you would see. Hotels, grocery stores, law offices, barbershops, beauty salons, jewelers, tailors, billiard halls, a theater, the Dreamland Theater, where Black Tulsans watched films and attended concerts, a public library, 2 newspapers, a hospital, a post office, churches, grand, beautiful churches that served as the center of community life. More than 300 Black-owned businesses operated within the Greenwood district. More than 10,000 Black residents called it home. There were 2 Black-owned schools, a dozen Black churches, and a bus system that connected the community. The neighborhood had its own economy, and critically, that economy circulated within the community itself. A dollar spent in Greenwood stayed in Greenwood, sometimes changing hands as many as 30 times before it ever left the district. Think about what that means. In a country that was doing everything it legally and socially could to keep Black Americans from accumulating wealth, through redlining, through discriminatory lending, through wage suppression, through terror, the people of Greenwood had built something that white supremacy had declared impossible. They had built prosperity. Real, durable, generational prosperity. And they had done it not because the system helped them, but because they had built a system of their own. Let's slow down for a moment. Because it's easy to talk about Greenwood in terms of statistics and economic data. But what made Greenwood special wasn't just what its residents owned. It was how they lived. On Sunday mornings, the churches of Greenwood overflowed. Reverend B.S. Roberts preached at Vernon AME Church, his sermons drawing hundreds. The congregation dressed in their finest, not as performance, but as declaration. As an assertion that they were dignified, worthy, and free, whatever the signs on the other side of the tracks might say. On Friday evenings, the Dreamland Theater lit up. Movies played. Musical acts came through town. People laughed and danced and argued about art and beauty. The Dreamland wasn't just a theater, it was proof that Black Tulsans had an inner life that had nothing to do with white approval. In the mornings, children walked to school at Booker T. Washington High School, a school that, despite being starved of the resources given to white schools, produced graduates who went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business leaders. The teachers at Booker T. Washington were among the most educated people in the state of Oklahoma, Black or white. They were there, teaching Black children in a segregated school, because they refused to let segregation define the limits of Black possibility. And then there were the individual stories. Dr. A.C. Jackson, described by the Mayo Clinic as the most able Black surgeon in America, operated his practice in Greenwood. O.W. Gurley, a Harvard-educated entrepreneur, had built an entire city block of Black-owned properties almost single-handedly after moving to Tulsa in 1906, deliberately choosing to live and invest on the Black side of the tracks. J.B. Stratford ran the Stratford Hotel, at 54 rooms, one of the largest Black-owned hotels in the United States, on a philosophy that Black Americans deserved first-class accommodations. These were not exceptional cases in Greenwood. They were the norm. They were what happened when a community was left to build for itself, when necessity and ingenuity and pride combined into something that the rest of the country had no adequate framework to understand. Which is perhaps why it was so threatening. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about Black Wall Street that history rarely confronts directly. Greenwood didn't just represent economic success. In the context of 1921 America, it represented a direct challenge to the racial hierarchy that the entire political and social structure of the American South, and increasingly, the North, had been built to maintain. The ideology of white supremacy required Black poverty. It required Black subservience. It required the visible, daily confirmation that Black people were, as the system claimed, inferior, incapable of self-determination, unworthy of full citizenship. Greenwood shattered that lie every single day simply by existing. And there were people in Tulsa, people in Oklahoma, people across America, who could not tolerate it. Monday, May 30th, 1921. Memorial Day. The holiday falls on a warm spring morning in Tulsa, and the city is busy. Sometime in the late morning or early afternoon, the exact time is uncertain, as are many details of what followed. A young Black man named Dick Rowland enters the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa to use the elevator. The elevator was operated by a young white woman named Sarah Page. What happened next inside that elevator is one of the great mysteries of American history. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was, in all likelihood, entirely mundane. The most credible historical accounts suggest that Roland likely stumbled as he entered the elevator, possibly stepping on Page's foot, or grabbing her arm to steady himself. Page screamed. A clerk in a nearby store heard the scream and called police. That's it. That, in all probability, is what happened. Roland, who was 19 years old and had no criminal record, fled the scene, not because he was guilty, but because he understood, with the bone-deep instinct of a black man in 1921 Oklahoma, exactly how this could look, and what that look could cost him. The next day, May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune ran a front-page story beneath a headline so inflammatory, so irresponsible, so deliberately incendiary that it would help set an entire neighborhood on fire. The exact wording of that original headline has been lost to history. The pages of that day's Tribune were deliberately removed from public archives, but witnesses and contemporaries described it as accusing Roland of assaulting Page, language that in the American South of 1921 carried a specific and deadly charge. It also reportedly ran an editorial, since destroyed, that called for a lynching. Word spread through white Tulsa with the speed and heat of a brush fire. Dick Roland was arrested that afternoon and taken to the Tulsa County Courthouse. Within hours, a white mob had gathered outside, growing, as the afternoon wore into evening, from dozens to hundreds. Their intention was clear. They wanted Dick Roland. They wanted to administer the kind of justice that had been applied to black men across the American South for decades. The rope, the fire, the ritual of terror that law enforcement either couldn't or wouldn't stop. Inside Greenwood, word was also spreading. And here is where the story takes a turn that is often misrepresented in popular retellings. The black residents of Greenwood did not sit quietly and wait for the mob to act. On the evening of May 31st, a group of black World War I veterans, men who had served their country, who had fought in Europe, who had come home to a city that still treated them as second-class citizens, armed themselves and went to the courthouse. Their purpose was to offer themselves as an additional guard for Dick Roland, to ensure that what had happened to countless other black men in countless other American counties would not happen here. There were approximately 75 to 100 of them. They were met by a white crowd that had grown to around 1,500 people. There are different accounts of what happened next. Most historians believe a confrontation erupted when a white man attempted to disarm one of the black veterans, a man named O.B. Man, by several accounts, and a shot was fired. Whether that shot was intentional or accidental, whether it came from the white side or the black side, is something historians continue to debate. What is not in debate is what happened after that shot rang out. The white mob, many of whom had been arming themselves throughout the evening, attacked. The black veterans fought back and retreated north toward Greenwood, firing as they went. Several people on both sides were killed in the running battle. And as the veterans retreated back across the railroad tracks, it became clear that what had begun as a potential lynching had transformed into something far larger. Something coordinated. Something that would not stop until it had consumed everything. What happened in Tulsa on the night of May 31st and the morning of June 1st, 1921, was not a riot. Let's be precise about language, because language matters here. A riot is chaotic. A riot has no clear organization. What happened in Tulsa was a massacre, and it was, in critical respects, a coordinated one. As the black veterans retreated toward Greenwood, white mobs, later estimated in the thousands, began pouring into the district from multiple directions. They came armed. They came organized. They came, in many cases, with the explicit assistance of local law enforcement. Let that sink in for a moment. The people sworn to protect the residents of Greenwood were not protecting them. In documented and verified accounts, Tulsa police officers and sheriff's deputies actively participated in the attack, arresting black residents attempting to defend their homes while allowing white attackers to continue unchallenged. Some officers were later reported to have been seen looting black-owned businesses alongside the mob. Special deputies were sworn in, hundreds of them, in the hours after the courthouse confrontation. These were not trained law enforcement officers. They were, in many cases, members of the very mob that was attacking Greenwood. They were given badges and told to arrest all Negroes they encountered. The violence moved through Greenwood like a wave. Homes were broken into. Families dragged from their beds at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Businesses that had taken decades to build were looted in minutes. Furniture carried into the streets, safes cracked, merchandise piled into trucks. And then, after the looting was done, the fires were set. Not one fire. Not an accident. Fires set systematically, block by block, building by building, with a deliberateness that makes clear this was not crowd madness but coordinated destruction. Witnesses described men moving through the neighborhood with torches. Others described white men in automobiles shooting at anyone who tried to flee the flames. Dr. A.C. Jackson, the brilliant surgeon whom the Mayo Clinic had called the finest black surgeon in America, came out of his home with his hands raised when attackers came for him. He offered no resistance. He was shot and killed in his front yard. Reverend H.T.S. Johnson watched from his church as the mob set fire to Mount Zion Baptist Church, a church so new that its congregation was still paying off the $92,000 mortgage. The church had been built with the savings of working people, dollar by dollar, over years. It burned in less than an hour. The residents of Greenwood fled north and east, into the countryside, hiding in drainage ditches and creek beds, clutching children, trying to stay silent while the sky behind them glowed orange. Some hid under floorboards of buildings the mob hadn't yet reached. Some were sheltered by white neighbors who, at significant personal risk, refused to participate in what was happening. But most were simply refugees in their own city. By the early morning hours of June 1st, the Greenwood district was in flames from one end to the other. The fire department, when it responded at all, prioritized protecting the white side of the tracks. Now we need to address one of the most contested and disturbing aspects of the massacre, the reports of aerial attacks. Multiple witnesses, in accounts collected at the time and in later testimonies, described seeing airplanes circling over Greenwood during the attack. Some witnesses claimed the planes were firing on residents attempting to escape. Others described objects being dropped from planes, though what those objects were, incendiary devices, bullets, or something else, remains disputed. Here is what we know. The city of Tulsa did use aircraft during the massacre. This has been confirmed by multiple historical sources, including the Oklahoma Commission that investigated the events decades later. The planes were almost certainly used for surveillance, to track the movements of black residents attempting to escape. Whether those aircraft fired on or dropped incendiary devices onto residents is something that historical evidence supports circumstantially but cannot definitively confirm. Some credible historians believe the firing accounts are accurate. Others believe the witnesses, while absolutely truthful in their terror, may have misidentified the source of fire in the chaos of a burning neighborhood. What is not in dispute is this: aircraft were used as instruments of terror against American citizens in an American city, and that fact alone places the Tulsa massacre in a category of state-sanctioned violence that few events in American history can match. By the time the sun rose over Tulsa on June 1, 1921, the Greenwood district was gone. 35 blocks of homes, businesses, churches, schools, and community life, reduced to ash and rubble. The numbers tell part of the story. Approximately 1,250 homes were burned to the ground. More than 10,000 black residents were left homeless in a single night. At least 35 square blocks of the district were completely destroyed. More than 300 people are estimated to have died, though the true number may be significantly higher, as many bodies were believed to have been buried in mass graves or otherwise concealed. Over 800 people were admitted to hospitals with injuries. The economic losses were staggering. In today's dollars, the property destruction has been estimated at well over $100 million. Some estimates reach far higher when accounting for the full economic ecosystem: the businesses, the inventory, the equipment, the generational wealth that was destroyed along with the buildings. But here is what the numbers cannot capture. They cannot capture a mother running through a burning street with her infant against her chest and no idea where her husband is. They cannot capture an old man watching the hardware store he spent 40 years building reduced to a pile of glowing cinders. They cannot capture the particular silence that falls over a community when its entire visible history, Its photographs, its documents, its records, the physical proof of its existence and dignity, is incinerated. They cannot capture what it means to lose not just a building but a future. Not just a home but a heritage. Not just a neighborhood but a proof, a living, breathing proof, that the story America told about black people was a lie. Greenwood proved that black Americans, given even the narrowest corridor of self-determination, could build something extraordinary. And in one night, that proof was erased. Against every odd imaginable, many of the residents of Greenwood came back. They returned to a neighborhood that was now a wasteland, 35 blocks of rubble, ash, and ghosts. The city of Tulsa, rather than providing relief or resources, moved almost immediately to capitalize on the destruction. City officials proposed new zoning ordinances in the days immediately following the massacre that would have prevented black residents from rebuilding on their own land, effectively allowing the city to seize the destroyed Greenwood district and repurpose it. A proposed ordinance would have required brick construction for any new buildings in Greenwood, a requirement that would have been financially impossible for displaced residents who had just lost everything. The residents of Greenwood, supported by black lawyers, black newspapers, and the nascent National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, fought back. They organized. They challenged the zoning changes in court. And they began to rebuild. They built with their own hands, with whatever they could salvage, in the face of an insurance industry that almost universally refused to honor the claims of black Tulsa residents, citing riot clauses in their policies. Not a single survivor of the Tulsa massacre received government compensation. The city of Tulsa paid out nothing. Oklahoma paid out nothing. The federal government, which bore its own share of responsibility, paid out nothing. What the people of Greenwood built in the years that followed was, in some ways, almost as remarkable as what had come before. By the mid-1920s, the district was rebuilding. By the 1930s, a new Greenwood Avenue had emerged, smaller, scarred, but functional. The community demonstrated a resilience that was simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking, because no community should have to be that resilient. No people should have to rebuild from zero because their government permitted a mob to burn them out. But the rebuilding happened under a dark cloud of ongoing injustice that made true recovery impossible. Dick Rowland, the young man whose elevator encounter had provided the pretext for all of this, was released from custody after Sarah Page declined to press charges, as many historians believe she had made clear she never intended to. He was never prosecuted. He quietly left Tulsa and, by most accounts, never returned. The hundreds of black Tulsans who had been arrested during the massacre, many of whom had been trying to defend their own homes, were held in detention camps at the Tulsa Fairgrounds and at McNulty Park for days without charge, forced to carry identification cards at all times and prohibited from moving freely until a white person vouched for them. Their own city had turned them into prisoners. Not a single white attacker was ever prosecuted for the massacre. Not one person served a day in prison for burning down an entire American neighborhood, for the deaths of hundreds of people, for one of the largest single acts of domestic terrorism in the country's history. The grand jury that convened in the aftermath managed to indict several black Tulsa residents for inciting the riot, a piece of juridical fiction so grotesque it would be almost funny if it weren't so perfectly emblematic of how American justice has historically functioned. And then, silence. Here is one of the most extraordinary facts about the Tulsa Race Massacre. For most of the 20th century, it effectively did not exist in the official historical record. It was not in Oklahoma's state history textbooks. It was not commemorated with any monuments or memorials. It was not taught in Tulsa's schools. It was not widely reported on by the national press in its immediate aftermath, and what coverage existed was largely dismissive of the scale and cause of the destruction. The massacre was, in the most deliberate and systematic sense of the word, erased. How does something this large, this catastrophic, this well-witnessed, simply disappear from history? The answer tells us something essential about how historical memory works, about who gets to decide what is remembered, and about the lengths to which powerful people will go to protect themselves from accountability. In the immediate aftermath, the city of Tulsa had every incentive to minimize and suppress what had happened. The potential legal and financial liability was enormous. The reputational damage to a city that was, at the time, riding an oil boom and presenting itself as a model of American progress and prosperity was equally enormous. And so the story was buried, not in a single dramatic act of censorship, but in the slow accumulation of small erasures. The Tulsa Tribune's original front page was removed from public archives. Police and city government records were destroyed or went missing. The official narrative that this had been a Negro uprising that Tulsa's white citizens had been forced to suppress was allowed to harden into received history. The survivors themselves largely kept silent, not because they wanted to forget, but because they had learned, in the most brutal possible way, what happened when black people in America drew attention to their grievances. The Greenwood community rebuilt in silence, nursing its wounds, maintaining what dignity it could, while the city around it pretended nothing had happened. The silence lasted for generations. It lasted until 1971, when a young journalist named Ed Wheeler wrote an article for a Tulsa magazine marking the 50th anniversary of the massacre, one of the first major attempts to document what had happened. Wheeler was met with hostility and attempts to suppress the story. It lasted until the 1990s, when academic historians began engaging seriously with the archival record, interviewing aging survivors, and constructing a documentary history of events that most of the country had never heard of. It lasted until 2001, when the Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, established by the state legislature, released a landmark report formally documenting the massacre, its causes, and its consequences. The report recommended reparations for survivors and their descendants. The recommendation was never acted upon. It lasted until 2020, 99 years after the massacre, when the murder of George Floyd and the renewed national reckoning with American racism brought the Tulsa massacre to mainstream national attention in a way it had never previously experienced. When then-President Donald Trump announced a campaign rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 19, Juneteenth, 2020, the collision of symbolism was so explosive that it became international news. Suddenly, people across the world were learning for the first time about what had happened in Greenwood in 1921. 99 years. That is how long it took for one of the worst acts of domestic terrorism in American history to receive mainstream national attention. Why does this erasure matter? Not as an abstraction. Not as a rhetorical point. But concretely, practically, in terms of real human lives, why does it matter? It matters because the survivors of the massacre were denied not only compensation but acknowledgement. They spent their lives carrying the weight of an atrocity that the world around them refused to see. That psychological and social cost is real and immeasurable. It matters because the economic effects of the massacre cascaded through generations. The wealth that was destroyed in 1921, the businesses, the property, the savings, the generational capital, was never restored. The families who lost everything in Greenwood started over from nothing, and the compounding economic disadvantage of that loss persisted through their children and their grandchildren and into the present day. It matters because history that is not taught is history that can be repeated. When communities are not required to grapple with the worst of what they have done, they are free to tell a different story about themselves. A story in which the racial inequalities that persist into the present are mysterious and inexplicable rather than the direct, traceable consequences of specific acts of theft and terror. And it matters because truth itself matters. Because a society that cannot look honestly at its own history is a society that cannot honestly understand itself. The Greenwood district still exists. You can go there today. You can visit the Greenwood Cultural Center, established in 1995, which houses a museum and archive dedicated to the history of the massacre and the community that survived it. You can stand on Greenwood Avenue and try to imagine what it looked like in 1921, the hotels and theaters and law offices and the 10,000 people who called it home. What you will not see is what was there before. The neighborhood was never fully rebuilt. Urban renewal projects in the 1960s and 1970s, which disproportionately targeted black urban communities across America, further fragmented what remained of Greenwood. A highway was built through the district. The population declined. The economic ecosystem that had once been self-sustaining and extraordinary was never restored. But the story, the full story, is finally being told. In 2021, for the first time in the massacre's 100-year history, the centennial was marked with national attention. Congressional hearings were held. Major news outlets published long-form features. The television series Watchmen, on HBO, had introduced millions of younger viewers to the massacre through a dramatized prologue. Historians, journalists, and community advocates had spent years working to ensure that the centennial was marked with something more than silence. 3 survivors were alive to see it: Leslie Benningfield Randall, Hughes Van Ellis, and Viola Fletcher. They were, respectively, 107, 101, and 107 years old. They had carried this history in their bodies for a century. Viola Fletcher testified before the House Judiciary Committee in 2021. She told Congress, "I will never forget the morning of June 1, 1921. I was 7 years old, and our family had to flee our home quickly. I remember my family leaving our home, and the chaos we encountered on the streets. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I still hear the screams." The question of reparations remains one of the most contested and important conversations in American public life. The Oklahoma Commission recommended reparations in 2001. As of this recording, no reparations have been paid. Lawsuits on behalf of survivors and their descendants have made their way through the courts, with the most recent case, brought by the last surviving witnesses, dismissed in 2023, though appeals continued. But this is not only a story about money. And it is not only a story about Tulsa. It is a story about what America chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. About who gets to define the national story. About whether the phrase, liberty and justice for all, is meant as a description of reality or as an aspiration that requires constant, difficult, contested work to make real. The Greenwood massacre is often framed as a story about black suffering, and it is that. But it is equally a story about black power, black brilliance, black economic self-determination, and black survival. The people of Greenwood built something extraordinary. When it was taken from them, they tried to build it again. And when their story was buried, their descendants and their advocates spent decades insisting that it be unearthed. That insistence is itself a form of power. What does it mean that a community can be so thoroughly destroyed, so completely buried in official silence, and still, 100 years later, insist on being seen? What does it say about the resilience of a people that their story, however suppressed, however marginalized, refused to die? The houses on Greenwood Avenue were built from lumber and sweat and hard-earned dollars. They stood for years and were burned in a night. But the memory of what stood there, the idea of it, the proof of what is possible, proved to be more fireproof than anything a mob could carry. They burned the buildings. They buried the history. But they could not erase the truth. And the truth is this: Black Wall Street existed. It was real. It was magnificent. And understanding what happened to it, really understanding it, in all its specific, documented, devastating detail, is not an act of looking backward. It is an act of seeing clearly. If this story moved you, if you learned something today, please share this video. Not for the algorithm. For Viola Fletcher. For Hughes Van Ellis. For the 10,000 people who woke up in their homes on the morning of May 31, 1921, and never went back. Their story deserves to be heard.